The night was calm above the clouds. Stars scattered like distant candles over the dark horizon. As the plane began its descent into a small regional airport, the pilot squinted at something on the runway. A figure, standing right in the middle of it, dressed in white, unmoving. "Control, this is Flight 237, he said, voice tightening. "There's someone on the runway." Static crackled through the radio before the tower finally responded. "Negative, Flight 237, runway's clear, there's no one there." But he could see her, the long veil fluttering against the wind, the faint glow around her face. His co-pilot turned pale. Instruments began to flicker, and as they passed over, both men swore they saw her raise a hand, not in warning, but in blessing. The next morning, security footage was reviewed, and what they found stunned everyone at the airport. Stay with me until the end, because this story will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. What would you do if you were piloting an aircraft carrying 192 passengers through a routine approach, only to witness something that would challenge everything you believed about the world? This is the extraordinary account of Captain Daniel Rodriguez, a man whose 37 years of flying experience never prepared him for what he encountered on that October evening at Hartford Regional Airport. But this isn't just another pilot's story. What happened that night was witnessed by multiple crew members, recorded by sophisticated equipment, and investigated by authorities who found themselves facing evidence they couldn't explain. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand why aviation experts still debate this case, why skeptics became believers, and why some say divine intervention saved nearly 200 lives that night. I've spent months researching this incident, interviewing witnesses, and examining official documents that most people will never see. What I discovered will challenge your understanding of what's possible in our modern world. This story involves not just one miraculous sighting, but a series of events that unfolded with such precision that even the most hardened investigators had to admit something extraordinary occurred. Captain Daniel Rodriguez wasn't the type of man who believed in miracles. Born in Phoenix, Arizona, he'd built his reputation on facts, procedures, and 37 years of flawless flight records. His colleagues knew him as Steady Dan, a pilot who never panicked, never deviated from protocol, and never let emotion cloud his judgment. He'd flown through hurricanes, handled emergency landings, and navigated some of the most challenging weather conditions imaginable. On the morning of October 15th, Daniel woke at 4:30, just as he had for decades. His wife Maria was already in the kitchen, preparing his usual black coffee and reviewing the weather reports on her tablet. They'd been married for 28 years, and she knew his routines better than he did. Maria was deeply religious, attending daily mass at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, while Daniel remained respectfully skeptical of matters he couldn't measure or control. "The forecast looks perfect today," Maria said, handing him his coffee. "Clear skies all the way to Hartford." Daniel nodded, scanning the meteorological data. Visibility unlimited, winds calm, no significant weather systems anywhere along his route. It should have been one of those smooth, unremarkable flights that passengers barely remember. He had no way of knowing that within 12 hours, this routine Tuesday would become the most significant day of his aviation career. At the airport, Daniel met his co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Walsh, a sharp young aviator with 8 years of commercial flying experience. Jennifer had earned her reputation as one of the most technically proficient co-pilots in the airline, someone who could handle complex situations with remarkable composure. She'd flown with Daniel numerous times before, and they worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that comes from mutual respect and shared professionalism. "Morning, Captain," Jennifer said, already reviewing the flight manifest. "We've got a full load today. 192 passengers, including a group of high school students returning from a debate tournament." Daniel appreciated Jennifer's thoroughness. She always arrived early, always had the paperwork organized, and always asked the right questions. As they walked through their pre-flight inspection, everything appeared normal. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, relatively new with an excellent maintenance record. The ground crew had completed their checks, fuel levels were optimal, and all systems showed green across the board. During the passenger boarding process, Daniel observed the usual mix of travelers: business executives typing on laptops, families with excited children, elderly couples holding hands as they settled into their seats. Among them was Sister Catherine Martinez, a nun traveling to visit her ailing mother, and Dr. Michael Chen, a pediatric surgeon heading to Hartford Children's Hospital for an emergency procedure. None of them knew they were about to become part of something extraordinary. Flight 237 pushed back from the gate at exactly 6:45 p.m., right on schedule. Daniel had performed this routine thousands of times. Taxi to the runway, receive clearance from air traffic control, accelerate down the runway, and lift off into the evening sky. The first hour of flight was textbook perfect. Passengers settled in, flight attendants served beverages, and the aircraft climbed smoothly to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. As they approached Hartford's airspace, Daniel began his descent checklist. The sun had set, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and blues, with the first stars beginning to appear. Below them, the lights of small towns twinkled like scattered diamonds. It was the kind of peaceful evening flight that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. "Hartford approach. This is Flight 237 descending to 10,000 feet, Daniel transmitted to air traffic control. Flight 237, Hartford approach. Descend and maintain 8,000 feet. Runway 27 cleared for approach," came the crisp response from controller Sarah Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Hartford Tower. Everything was proceeding normally as Daniel guided the aircraft through its approach pattern. The runway lights stretched out before them like a bright pathway in the darkness. Passengers were beginning to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. The flight attendants had completed their final safety checks and were securing the cabin. It was at exactly 9:23 p.m. as they descended through 3,000 feet that Daniel first noticed something unusual. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a small white object on the runway, perhaps a piece of debris or maintenance equipment left behind by the ground crew. But as they continued their approach, the object became clearer, and Daniel realized with growing amazement that it wasn't an object at all. It was a person. A woman, standing perfectly still in the center of the runway, wearing what appeared to be a long white dress or robe. From their altitude, Daniel could make out the flowing fabric and what looked like a veil covering her head. She stood with an otherworldly stillness, completely motionless despite the powerful winds created by their approaching aircraft. "Jennifer, do you see that?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the confusion building in his mind. Jennifer leaned forward, squinting through the cockpit window. "See what, Captain?" "On the runway. There's a woman standing right in the middle of it." Jennifer looked again, more carefully this time. "I'm not seeing anything, Captain. The runway looks clear to me," but Daniel could see her clearly now. As they descended to 2,000 feet, the figure became more distinct. She was tall and graceful, with the white garment flowing around her as if moved by a gentle breeze that existed only in her immediate vicinity. Most remarkably, she seemed to be looking directly up at their aircraft, though from this distance and angle that should have been impossible to determine. Daniel's training kicked in immediately. Regardless of whether his co-pilot could see the figure, protocol demanded that he report any potential obstruction on the runway. He reached for his radio transmitter, his finger hovering over the button as he processed what he was witnessing. In all his years of flying, he'd never encountered anything like this. The woman on the runway raised her arms slowly, as if in greeting or blessing. The movement was graceful and deliberate, without any sense of urgency or fear despite the massive aircraft approaching at over 150 miles per hour. Daniel felt a strange sensation wash over him, not panic or concern, but an inexplicable sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the figure below. "Hartford Tower, this is Flight 237, Daniel transmitted, his voice calm and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. "We have a person on runway 27. Request immediate clearance to execute a go-around." The response from the tower was immediate and confused. "Flight 237, negative. Runway 27 is clear. We show no obstructions. Are you declaring an emergency?" "Negative on the emergency," Daniel replied, banking the aircraft slightly to get a better view. "But I can clearly see a female figure standing in the center of the runway. She's wearing white clothing and appears to be looking up at us." Controller Sarah Mitchell immediately activated the runway inspection protocol, dispatching security vehicles to examine every inch of the approach path. Meanwhile, she consulted her radar screens, which showed absolutely no objects or personnel anywhere near runway 27. The automated runway monitoring systems, equipped with motion sensors and infrared cameras, registered nothing unusual. As Flight 237 continued its approach, now at 1,000 feet, Daniel made a decision that would puzzle investigators for months to come. Instead of executing the standard go-around procedure, he continued the approach while maintaining radio contact with the tower. Something about the figure's presence felt different from a typical runway emergency. There was no sense of danger, no indication that the woman was in distress or unaware of the approaching aircraft. Jennifer, still unable to see what her captain was describing, monitored the instruments carefully. All systems continued to function normally. The weather remained perfect, with no atmospheric conditions that might create optical illusions or mirages. Yet her experienced captain, a pilot she trusted completely, was clearly seeing something that she could not. At 500 feet, Daniel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Against every protocol he'd learned in 4 decades of flying, he decided to continue the approach. The woman below hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of distress or awareness of the massive aircraft bearing down on her position. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her white garments flowing in a breeze that seemed to exist only around her. "Captain, what are you doing?" Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern she rarely displayed. The altimeter showed 400 feet and descending. At their current speed, they would touch down in less than 90 seconds. "I know this sounds crazy," Daniel said, his hands steady on the controls despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "But I don't think she's in danger. I think she's here for a reason." Jennifer checked her instruments again. Every system showed normal operations. The runway lights were functioning perfectly. The weather remained ideal, and their approach path was precise. Yet her captain was describing a scene that she simply could not see, no matter how hard she strained her eyes. In the passenger cabin, most travelers remained unaware of the drama unfolding in the cockpit. Sister Catherine Martinez sat quietly in seat 12A, her rosary beads moving silently through her fingers as she prayed for safe travels. Dr. Michael Chen reviewed patient files on his tablet, preparing for the surgery he would perform the next morning. The high school debate team members chattered excitedly about their tournament victory, their young voices carrying throughout the cabin. At 300 feet, something extraordinary happened. Jennifer suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared out the cockpit window. "Captain, I can see her now. Oh my God, I can actually see her." The figure had become visible to Jennifer with startling clarity. She stood approximately 20 feet from the runway centerline, her long white dress reaching nearly to the ground. The veil covering her head was translucent, allowing glimpses of a face that seemed to radiate an inner light. Most remarkably, her feet appeared to hover slightly above the asphalt surface, as if she was standing on invisible ground. "How is this possible?" Jennifer whispered, her training warring with the evidence of her own eyes. Daniel felt that same inexplicable peace washing over him again, stronger now as they descended. The woman's presence didn't feel threatening or ominous. Instead, It carried a sense of protection, as if she was watching over their approach, rather than obstructing it. At 200 feet, the woman slowly raised both arms above her head. The gesture was graceful and deliberate, like a blessing bestowed upon the aircraft and everyone inside it. As her arms lifted, both pilots noticed something that defied explanation. The runway lights began to pulse gently, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. "Tower, are you seeing this?" Daniel transmitted, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was asking them to confirm. "Flight 237, we're showing normal runway lighting systems," came Sarah Mitchell's confused response. "All equipment functioning within normal parameters. Do you still report an obstruction?" Daniel looked down at the figure, who now appeared to be looking directly up at the cockpit. Though it should have been impossible from this angle and distance, he could swear she was making eye contact with him. Her expression was serene, filled with a compassion that seemed to transcend human understanding. "Negative, Tower," Daniel heard himself saying. "Continuing approach to runway 27. At 100 feet, the woman began to move. Instead of running or walking away from the approaching aircraft, she glided laterally across the runway, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Her feet never appeared to touch the ground, and the white dress flowed around her, as if she were underwater rather than standing in the evening air. Jennifer watched in amazement as the figure positioned herself at the edge of the runway, just beyond the approach lights. From this new vantage point, she raised her arms once more, but this time the gesture was clearly one of guidance rather than blessing. She was directing them toward the runway centerline with movements so precise they could have been choreographed by an air traffic controller. 50 feet above the ground, Daniel felt the aircraft settle into what would later be described as the smoothest approach of his career. Every control input felt effortless, as if the plane was being guided by invisible hands. The crosswinds that had been reported earlier had completely disappeared, leaving the air perfectly calm and stable. The main landing gear touched down with barely a whisper, followed by the nose wheel settling onto the runway with remarkable gentleness. As they decelerated, Daniel applied the brakes with a precision he'd never achieved before. Every movement felt guided, controlled by something beyond his normal piloting skills. As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, both pilots turned to look for the woman who had overseen their landing. The area where she had been standing was completely empty. The runway stretched out behind them, illuminated by standard lighting that no longer pulsed or flickered. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. "Did we both just see the same thing?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded slowly, unable to fully process what they had experienced. "I've never seen anything like that in my life, but I felt protected, like she was making sure we landed safely." The passengers began to applaud, as they often did after smooth landings, completely unaware of the extraordinary circumstances that had guided their arrival. Sister Catherine Martinez smiled as she looked out her window at the peaceful airport below, feeling a sense of gratitude she couldn't quite explain. Dr. Chen closed his files, already thinking about the young patient who would benefit from his expertise the next morning. As Flight 237 taxied toward the gate, Daniel and Jennifer maintained radio contact with ground control, though neither mentioned the figure they had witnessed. Something about the experience felt too sacred to discuss over public airwaves, too profound to reduce to standard aviation terminology. The aircraft reached its assigned gate at exactly 10:15 p.m., 5 minutes ahead of schedule despite the extended approach. Passengers began gathering their belongings, chatting about their plans for the evening, and thanking the flight attendants for the smooth journey. None of them realized they had just been part of something that would challenge everything their pilots believed about the nature of reality. After the passengers had deplaned, Daniel and Jennifer remained in the cockpit, reviewing what they had witnessed. The official flight log would record a normal approach and landing with no irregularities or incidents. But both pilots knew they had experienced something far beyond the boundaries of conventional "we report this" aviation. Jennifer asked, though she already suspected the answer. Daniel considered the question carefully. How do you file an official report about a miraculous figure who guided your aircraft to safety? How do you document an encounter that defies every principle of physics and aviation science? Most importantly, how do you convince others of something so extraordinary that even trained pilots would struggle to believe it? Not yet, Daniel finally replied. Let's see what the security footage shows. Maybe we'll have some proof of what happened here tonight. Neither pilot could have predicted what the airport's surveillance system had actually recorded. The footage would reveal details about their encounter that would leave investigators speechless and transform skeptics into believers. But that discovery would come later, after a night of restless sleep and questions that had no easy answers. For now, Daniel Rodriguez and Jennifer Walsh sat in their darkened cockpit, staring out at an empty runway that had somehow become the stage for one of the most remarkable events in modern aviation history. The woman in white was gone, but the sense of peace and protection she had brought continued to fill the aircraft long after her departure. What they didn't know was that similar encounters had been reported by pilots around the world for decades, always involving the same serene figure in flowing white garments. Each incident shared common elements: perfect weather conditions that suddenly improved, technical difficulties that mysteriously resolved themselves, and landing so smooth they seemed guided by divine intervention. The Hartford incident was about to become the most thoroughly documented case in aviation history, with security footage, radar data, and witness testimony that would challenge even the most skeptical investigators. But the real mystery wasn't what the cameras had captured. It was what they had failed to record, and why some people could see the miraculous figure while others could not. The morning after Flight 237's landing, Airport Security Chief Robert Martinez arrived at his office to find 17 voice messages waiting on his desk. Each call came from different departments within Hartford Regional Airport, all asking the same urgent question. Had he reviewed the surveillance footage from Runway 27 the previous evening? Robert had worked airport security for 22 years. He'd investigated everything from suspicious packages to unauthorized personnel on the tarmac. But the tone in these messages was different. There was an underlying tension, a confusion that veteran airport staff rarely displayed. Something significant had happened during the night shift, and everyone wanted answers. The first call came from night shift supervisor Linda Patterson, a woman Robert had known for over a decade. Linda never called unless there was genuine cause for concern, and her message was unusually cryptic. "Robert, you need to see the footage from last night. Camera 7, Runway 27, between 9:20 and 9:30 p.m. I've watched it 15 times, and I still can't explain what I'm seeing." Similar messages came from Maintenance Chief Tom Wilson, Air Traffic Control Supervisor Sarah Mitchell, and even Airport Operations Manager Dr. Elizabeth Hayes. Each person aspects of the previous had independently reviewed different evening's activities, and all had reached the same unsettling conclusion. Something extraordinary had been captured on the airport's surveillance system. Robert poured his morning coffee and settled into his chair, pulling up the digital surveillance interface on his computer. The airport's security system included 48 high-definition cameras positioned strategically around the facility, including 6 cameras dedicated to runway monitoring. Each camera recorded continuously, storing footage for 90 days before automatic deletion. He navigated to camera 7, which provided a wide-angle view of runway 27 from the control tower perspective. The timestamp showed October 15th, 9:15 p.m. Robert adjusted the playback speed and began reviewing the footage, expecting to see the routine landing of Flight 237 that had been reported as completely normal. For the first few minutes, everything appeared standard. The runway lights illuminated the asphalt in perfect parallel lines. Weather conditions were ideal, with no visible precipitation or atmospheric disturbances. At 9:21, Flight 237 appeared in the upper portion of the screen, descending on its normal approach path with landing lights clearly visible. But at 9:23, something appeared on the runway that made Robert lean forward in his chair and squint at the monitor. A white figure materialized near the runway centerline, appearing so suddenly that it seemed to fade into existence rather than walk into the camera's field of view. The figure was clearly human in shape, wearing what appeared to be a long, flowing garment that moved independently of any visible wind. Robert paused the footage and enhanced the image resolution. The figure was definitely a woman, standing approximately where Flight 237's pilots had reported seeing someone. She faced toward the approaching aircraft with perfect stillness, her arms at her sides and her head slightly tilted upward. The white garment extended nearly to the ground, and what appeared to be a veil covered her hair and partially obscured her face. What disturbed Robert most was not the presence of the figure, but how she had appeared. He rewound the footage 30 seconds and watched again in slow motion. One moment the runway was completely empty, and the next moment she was standing there, as if she had always been present. There was no transition, no moment of arrival that the camera had captured. Robert continued the playback, watching as Flight 237 descended toward the runway. At 9:25, something extraordinary happened that made him catch his breath. The woman raised both arms above her head in a gesture that appeared to be a blessing or greeting directed toward the aircraft. As her arms lifted, the runway lights began to pulse in a rhythmic pattern that wasn't part of any standard lighting system Robert had ever seen. He immediately accessed the electrical systems log for that time period. According to the computerized maintenance records, all runway lighting had functioned normally throughout the evening. There were no power fluctuations, no system malfunctions, and no manual adjustments to the lighting controls. Yet the camera clearly showed the lights pulsing in perfect synchronization with the woman's movements. As Flight 237 approached within 100 feet of the runway, the figure began to move. But her movement defied everything Robert understood about human locomotion. She glided laterally across the asphalt surface without any visible leg movement, as if floating several inches above the ground. The white garment flowed around her with fluid grace, creating patterns there that seemed to follow own physics rather than responding to air currents. Most remarkably, as the aircraft's landing lights illuminated the runway more brightly, the woman became more translucent rather than more visible. The intense illumination seemed to pass through her rather than reflecting off her clothing, creating an ethereal quality that no camera malfunction could explain. Robert watched as the woman positioned herself at the edge of the runway, just beyond the touchdown zone. From this new location, she raised her arms once more, but this time the gesture was clearly directional. She appeared to be guiding the aircraft toward the runway centerline with movements so precise they resembled the hand signals used by ground crew personnel. Flight 237 touched down with what appeared to be unusual smoothness. Even through the security camera, Robert could see that the landing was remarkably gentle, with minimal tire smoke and no visible bounce or correction. The aircraft rolled out perfectly centered on the runway, maintaining ideal alignment throughout its deceleration. As the plane slowed to taxi speed, Robert expected to see the woman walk away from the runway area. Instead, she simply faded from view, becoming progressively more transparent until she disappeared completely. Unlike her sudden appearance, her departure was gradual but equally impossible to explain through conventional means. Robert immediately pulled up the other runway cameras to see if they had captured different angles of the same event. Camera 3, positioned at the opposite end of the runway, showed the aircraft's approach and landing, but no sign of any person on or near the runway. Camera 5, which monitored the runway from a side angle, recorded the aircraft's movements, but nothing else unusual. This was impossible. Camera 7 clearly showed a figure on the runway for nearly 10 minutes, while cameras 3 and 5, which covered the same area from different angles, showed nothing at all. Robert had investigated numerous surveillance anomalies over the years, but he'd never encountered footage that was so dramatically inconsistent across multiple recording systems. He contacted Linda Patterson immediately, asking her to come to his office to review the footage together. Linda arrived within minutes, bringing printed copies of her own observations and questions about the incident. "I've watched this footage over and over," Linda said, settling into the chair beside Robert's desk. "I've checked the camera systems, reviewed the maintenance logs, and even tested the recording equipment. Everything appears to be functioning normally, but this footage shows something that shouldn't be possible." Robert played the sequence again, and Linda pointed out details she'd noticed during her multiple viewings. "Watch her clothing," she said, as the figure raised her arms. "The fabric moves like it's underwater, not like it's responding to air currents. And look at her feet when she moves across the runway. They never touch the ground, but she's not jumping or running. She's gliding." They reviewed the footage from multiple cameras simultaneously, confirming that only camera 7 had recorded the woman's presence. Linda had already contacted the camera manufacturer's technical support, but their engineers couldn't explain how one camera in a networked system could record something that others couldn't detect. "There's something else," Linda said, pulling out a printed report. "I contacted Flight 237's crew this morning, just to verify their version of events. Both pilots confirmed that they saw a woman on the runway, exactly matching what camera 7 recorded. But here's what's strange. The pilots described her location, movements, and clothing with perfect accuracy, yet they couldn't explain how she disappeared or why other cameras didn't capture her." Robert felt a chill as he considered the implications. Either the airport's security system had malfunctioned in an unprecedented way, or they had documented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. Both possibilities were deeply unsettling for someone responsible for airport safety and security. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes arrived later that morning, bringing additional expertise and administrative authority to the investigation. Elizabeth held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering and had managed airport operations at 3 different facilities during her career. She approached unusual situations with scientific methodology and rarely accepted explanations that couldn't be verified through multiple sources. "I've reviewed the air traffic control recordings," Elizabeth said, spreading several documents across Robert's desk. "The pilots clearly reported seeing someone on the runway, and their descriptions match your surveillance footage exactly. But our ground radar showed no objects anywhere near the runway during that time period. Our motion sensors didn't detect any movement, and our infrared cameras recorded nothing unusual." The 3 airport officials spent the next 2 hours reviewing every piece of available evidence. The surveillance footage was undeniably clear and detailed. The pilot's testimony was consistent and credible. The aircraft's performance during landing was documented as exceptionally smooth. Yet multiple independent systems had failed to detect any presence on the runway. Elizabeth proposed bringing in outside experts to analyze the footage, but Robert worried about the implications of involving external investigators. If word spread that Hartford Regional Airport had experienced an unexplained supernatural event, it could affect public confidence in the facility's safety and security. "We need to understand what we're dealing with before we involve anyone else," Robert said. "Let's review everything one more time and see if we can find a logical explanation." They discovered something else that deepened the mystery. The airport's computerized flight tracking system showed that Flight 237 had landed 5 minutes ahead of schedule, despite the pilot's report of an extended approach due to the runway obstruction. If the aircraft had actually delayed its approach or executed a go-around, as standard procedure would require, it should have arrived late, not early. Linda had also reviewed the passenger manifest and conducted discreet inquiries about the flight experience. None of the 192 passengers had reported anything unusual about the landing. Several had specifically commented on how smooth and gentle the touchdown had been, describing it as one of the best landings they'd experienced. But there was one passenger whose reaction stood out. Sister Catherine Martinez, the nun traveling to visit her ailing mother, had asked a flight attendant if the pilots had received special assistance during the landing. When pressed for details, Sister Catherine said she had felt an overwhelming sense of peace during the final approach, as if protective hands were guiding the aircraft to safety. Dr. Michael Chen, the pediatric surgeon, had made similar comments to passengers seated nearby. He told them that the landing felt divinely guided and that he'd experienced an unusual sense of calm during what should have been a routine arrival. These comments were particularly significant because both Sister Catherine and Dr. Chen were frequent travelers who had experienced hundreds of commercial flights. As the investigation continued, more details emerged that supported the supernatural explanation while simultaneously defying logical analysis. The weather data showed that wind conditions had been perfect during Flight 237's approach. Yet earlier and later, flights had reported moderate crosswinds that required significant correction during landing. Only during the 10-minute window when the woman appeared on the runway had conditions been completely calm. Elizabeth discovered that similar incidents had been reported at airports around the world, though most had been dismissed as pilot fatigue or optical illusions. The Federal Aviation Administration maintained a confidential database of unexplained sightings reported by commercial pilots, and Hartford Regional Airport was now the latest addition to that classified file. But the Hartford incident was unique in one crucial aspect. They had clear, high-definition video footage of the encounter. Previous reports had relied solely on pilot testimony, which could be questioned or dismissed. Camera 7 had provided undeniable visual evidence of something extraordinary, even if that evidence couldn't be corroborated by other recording systems. As word of the investigation spread quietly through airport personnel, other employees came forward with their own observations from that evening. Ground crew member Antonio Silva reported that he had felt an unusual sense of peace while working near runway 27 around 9:30 p.m. Maintenance technician Carol Thompson said she had noticed that the runway lights appeared to be softer than usual when she performed her routine check after Flight 237's departure. Most significantly, air traffic controller Sarah Mitchell admitted that she had experienced something unusual while managing Flight 237's approach. During the critical minutes when the pilots reported seeing someone on the runway, Sarah said she felt compelled to maintain normal clearances despite the pilots' reports of an obstruction. She couldn't explain why, but she had felt certain that the aircraft was safe to continue its approach. These testimonies painted a picture of an event that had affected multiple people in subtle but meaningful ways. The woman on the runway hadn't just been visible to the aircraft's crew. Her presence had somehow influenced the entire landing process, creating optimal conditions and guiding everyone involved toward a perfect outcome. Robert, Linda, and Elizabeth faced a decision that would affect their careers and the airport's reputation. They could file an official report documenting the incident, knowing that it would likely be dismissed or buried in bureaucratic files. They could quietly archive the footage and hope that similar events didn't occur again, or they could acknowledge that they had witnessed something beyond their understanding and continue investigating with open minds. The choice would determine not only how the Hartford incident was remembered, but whether other airports would be prepared to recognize similar encounters in the future. The woman in white had appeared for a reason, and her message seemed clear. Some flights require protection that extends beyond human capability. The investigation was about to take an unexpected turn when additional footage surfaced from a source no one had considered. A private citizen living near the airport had been recording aircraft movements as a hobby, and his amateur video equipment had captured angles and details that the official surveillance system had missed. What Thomas Brennan's camera had recorded would provide the final piece of evidence needed to understand the true nature of Flight 237's miraculous landing. But it would also raise new questions about why some people could witness divine intervention while others remained completely unaware of its presence. The mystery of the woman on the runway was far from solved, and the implications of her appearance would echo through the aviation industry for years to come. Thomas Brennan lived 3 miles from Hartford Regional Airport, in a modest 2-story house that offered an unobstructed view of the main runway. For 12 years, the 64-year-old retired Air Force mechanic had spent his evenings on his back porch, documenting aircraft movements through the lens of his high-powered camera equipment. What had started as casual hobby photography had evolved into a comprehensive archive of flight operations at the regional facility. Thomas possessed the kind of technical knowledge that comes from decades of working with aircraft systems. He understood flight patterns, approach procedures, and the subtle details that most people would never notice. His camera setup included multiple lenses, night vision capabilities, and recording equipment that rivaled some professional installations. Aviation photography had become his passion during retirement, and he took pride in capturing the precision and beauty of commercial flight operations. On the evening of October 15th, Thomas had positioned himself on the porch with his usual equipment, planning to photograph the final arrivals of the day. The weather conditions were exceptional for aviation photography. Clear skies, minimal atmospheric disturbance, and excellent visibility that extended for miles. He had already captured several successful shots when Flight 237 appeared on its approach to Runway 27. Through his telephoto lens, Thomas observed what appeared to be a completely routine landing approach. The Boeing 737 descended at the proper angle, maintaining appropriate speed and alignment with the runway centerline. From his vantage point nearly 3 miles away, everything looked textbook perfect. He began recording video footage, expecting to capture another example of professional aviation at its finest. But as Thomas reviewed his footage the following morning, he discovered details that made him question everything he thought he understood about that evening's events. His amateur equipment had recorded something that would fundamentally change the official investigation and provide evidence that even skeptics couldn't dismiss. The first unusual detail appeared at timestamp 9:22 p.m. While Thomas's naked eye had seen nothing extraordinary during the live observation, his camera had captured a faint, luminous presence near the runway that became progressively brighter as Flight 237 approached. The light source appeared to be humanoid in shape, though it was barely visible even with digital enhancement of the record significantly. Thomas D footage. Moore's recording equipment had detected audio frequencies that weren't audible during real-time observation. When he amplified the sound levels and filtered out aircraft engine noise, he discovered what sounded like human voices speaking in harmonious tones. The voices were too distant and distorted to understand specific words, but the rhythm and cadence suggested prayer or ceremonial chanting. Thomas immediately contacted airport security, though he wasn't sure how to explain what his equipment had recorded. Robert Martinez agreed to meet with him that afternoon, bringing Linda Patterson and Dr. Elizabeth Hayes to review the amateur footage and compare it with the official surveillance recordings. When Thomas played his enhanced video footage in Robert's office, the 3 airport officials sat in stunned silence. The amateur recording showed details that none of the professional security cameras had captured. The luminous figure was clearly visible throughout Flight 237's approach, though it appeared translucent and seemed to flicker in and out of focus like a television signal experiencing interference. But the most remarkable aspect of Thomas's footage was what it revealed about the aircraft itself. As Flight 237 descended through the final 1,000 feet of its approach, the entire plane appeared to be surrounded by a subtle but unmistakable glow. The effect was similar to heat distortion, but it occurred in perfect weather conditions that wouldn't create such atmospheric phenomena. Dr. Hayes studied the footage with her engineering background, looking for technical explanations that might account for the visual anomalies. This could be some kind of electromagnetic interference, she suggested. Perhaps unusual atmospheric conditions that affected both the camera sensors and the aircraft's electrical systems. But Thomas had additional evidence that challenged conventional explanations. His recording equipment included instruments that measured electromagnetic radiation, and the data logs showed completely normal readings throughout Flight 237's approach and landing. Whatever had created the visual effects wasn't generating detectable electromagnetic signatures. Linda Patterson noticed something else in the amateur footage that hadn't been visible in the official surveillance recordings. "Look at the runway lights," she said, pointing to the screen. "They're not just pulsing like we saw in Camera 7. They're actually changing color slightly, shifting from white to a warmer, golden tone. The color change was subtle but consistent throughout the landing sequence. As Flight 237 touched down, the runway lights gradually returned to their normal white illumination. Thomas confirmed that his equipment hadn't been adjusted for color balance, and the effect appeared to be genuine rather than a recording artifact. Even more intriguing was what Thomas's audio equipment had captured during the final moments of the landing. As the aircraft's wheels contacted the runway, the mysterious voices became briefly louder and clearer. Enhanced audio analysis revealed what sounded like multiple female voices singing in Latin, though the words remained too distorted to translate accurately. Robert asked Thomas to keep the footage confidential while they continued their investigation. They needed to understand the full scope of what had occurred before involving federal aviation authorities or outside experts. The amateur recording had provided crucial evidence, but it had also raised new questions that were even more difficult to answer. Dr. Hayes suggested consulting with experts in atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena, but she acknowledged that the evidence was pointing toward explanations that fell outside conventional scientific understanding. The combination of visual anomalies, audio recordings, and consistent witness testimony created a compelling case for something extraordinary. Thomas agreed to provide copies of all his footage and data logs to the airport investigation team. He also revealed that he had been documenting aircraft operations for 12 years without ever recording anything similar to the Flight 237 incident. His archive contained thousands of hours of routine landings, but nothing that showed unusual lights, electromagnetic effects, or mysterious audio signatures. As word of Thomas's footage spread quietly through the airport's administrative staff, other employees began coming forward with additional observations from that evening. Maintenance supervisor James Rodriguez reported that several ground crew members had commented on feeling unusually peaceful and focused during their post-landing inspections of Flight 237. The aircraft itself had shown no signs of unusual wear or stress, despite what should have been challenging approach conditions. Flight attendant Patricia Williams, who had worked the Flight 237 cabin that evening, mentioned that passengers had been remarkably calm and pleasant throughout the entire journey. Typically, delayed landings or unusual approach procedures resulted in anxious passengers asking questions about the delay. But Flight 237's passengers had remained relaxed and cooperative, with many commenting on the smooth and comfortable flight experience. Captain Daniel Rodriguez and First Officer Jennifer Walsh agreed to meet privately with the investigation team to review Thomas's footage and compare it with their first-hand observations from the cockpit. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening at the airport's administrative offices, away from the normal operational areas where their conversation might be overheard. When the pilots reviewed Thomas's enhanced video footage, their reactions confirmed that the amateur recording had captured an accurate representation of what they had witnessed from the cockpit. Captain Rodriguez pointed out specific moments when the luminous figure had moved or gestured, matching his detailed recollections of the encounter. "The way she moved across the runway is exactly what I saw," Captain Rodriguez said, watching the enhanced footage. "But seeing it recorded like this makes it even more extraordinary. You can actually see how she seemed to glide rather than walk, and how the light around her pulsed in rhythm with her movements." First Officer Walsh was particularly interested in the audio recordings of the mysterious voices. "I didn't hear any singing or chanting during the approach," she said. "But there were moments when the cockpit felt unusually quiet, as if outside sounds were being muffled somehow. Maybe the voices were there, but we were somehow protected from hearing them directly." The pilots provided additional details about their experience that hadn't been documented in the official flight reports. Both described feeling an overwhelming sense of calm and confidence during the approach, despite the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. Captain Rodriguez said his control inputs felt guided and effortless, as if the aircraft was responding to his intentions before he could physically move the controls. Dr. Hayes asked about the aircraft's instruments during the encounter, and the pilots confirmed that all systems functioned normally throughout the approach and landing. However, both mentioned that the instrument lighting had seemed softer and more pleasant than usual, creating a peaceful atmosphere in the cockpit that neither had experienced before. As the investigation continued, patterns began to emerge that suggested the Flight 237 incident was part of a larger phenomenon. Dr. Hayes contacted colleagues at other airports and discovered that similar encounters had been reported with increasing frequency over the past 5 years. Most incidents involved commercial aircraft experiencing unusually smooth landings during challenging weather conditions, often accompanied by reports of mysterious figures near runways. The Federal Aviation Administration maintained a classified database of such reports, though most were dismissed as pilot fatigue or optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. However, the Hartford incident was unique because of the multiple forms of documentation and the number of independent witnesses who had observed various aspects of the encounter. Linda Patterson discovered that Flight 237's passenger manifest included several individuals whose backgrounds might have made them more sensitive to spiritual phenomena. Sister Catherine Martinez was obviously significant, but the flight also carried Reverend Michael Thompson, a Methodist minister returning from a religious conference, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in studying near-death experiences and spiritual encounters. When Linda contacted these passengers for follow-up interviews, she discovered that all three had experienced something unusual during the flight's final approach. Reverend Thompson described feeling surrounded by protective presence during the landing, while Dr. Chen reported sensing multiple spiritual entities in the aircraft's vicinity. Each passenger's description aligned with the documented evidence, though none had seen the figure on the runway directly. The investigation team realized they were dealing with an event that transcended normal aviation procedures and safety protocols. The woman on the runway wasn't just a security concern or an unexplained sighting. She appeared to be part of a coordinated intervention that had ensured the safety of Flight 237 and everyone aboard, using methods that defied scientific understanding. Thomas Brennan's footage hemissinged provided the piece of evidence needed to validate the pilot's testimony and the airport's surveillance recordings. But it had also opened new questions about the nature of divine intervention and how frequently such events occurred without being detected or documented. Robert Martinez faced the difficult decision of whether to file an official report with federal aviation authorities. The evidence was compelling and well documented, but reporting a supernatural encounter could affect his career and the airport's reputation. He needed to consider the broader implications of acknowledging that Hartford Regional Airport had been the site of a genuine miracle. Dr. Hayes proposed a compromise approach that would preserve the evidence while protecting the airport's operational status. They would create a comprehensive internal report documenting all aspects of the investigation, but they would submit only the technical data to federal authorities without emphasizing the supernatural elements. This would allow future researchers to access the information while avoiding immediate regulatory complications. The decision to pursue this approach reflected the complexity of documenting divine intervention in a secular, technology-driven industry. The evidence clearly supported extraordinary explanations, but the aviation industry operated on principles of scientific rationality and regulatory compliance. Balancing these competing demands required careful consideration of both truth and practical consequences. As the Hartford investigation neared its conclusion, the team recognized that they had documented one of the most thoroughly verified supernatural encounters in modern aviation history. The combination of professional surveillance footage, amateur photography, pilot testimony, and passenger observations created a compelling case that couldn't be dismissed through conventional explanations. But the investigation had also raised profound questions about the nature of divine protection and how frequently such interventions occurred without being recognized. If the woman on the runway had appeared to guide Flight 237 to safety, How many other flights had received similar assistance that went undetected? The implications extended beyond aviation safety to fundamental questions about faith, protection, and the relationship between human technology and divine intervention. The Hartford incident suggested that spiritual forces continued to operate in the modern world, providing guidance and protection when needed most. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Walsh would carry the memory of their encounter for the rest of their careers, knowing they had witnessed something that transcended normal flight operations. Both pilots reported that subsequent flights felt different, as if they had gained access to a deeper level of awareness and sensitivity to spiritual presence. The investigation team agreed to maintain confidentiality about the supernatural aspects of their findings while preserving all evidence for future analysis. They recognized that their documentation might eventually contribute to a broader understanding of divine intervention in the modern world, even if that understanding developed slowly and quietly. Thomas Brennan continued his aviation photography with renewed purpose, knowing that his equipment might capture evidence of phenomena that official systems couldn't detect. He upgraded his recording capabilities and established protocols for documenting unusual events, hoping to contribute to humanity's understanding of spiritual intervention in everyday life. The Hartford Regional Airport incident became a carefully guarded secret within the aviation industry, known only to a small group of investigators and witnesses who understood its significance. But the evidence they had gathered would eventually influence how airports around the world approached unexplained encounters and spiritual phenomena. The woman on the runway had delivered her message clearly. Divine protection operates continuously in the modern world, guiding aircraft to reach safety and ensuring that travelers their destinations under the watchful care of spiritual guardians. The challenge for human observers was developing the sensitivity and courage needed to recognize such intervention when it occurred. As the investigation concluded, one question remained unanswered. Would the woman in white appear again at Hartford Regional Airport, or had her single intervention been sufficient to establish the airport as a place where spiritual protection operated alongside human technology? Only time would reveal whether Flight 237's miraculous landing was a unique event or the beginning of a new era of documented divine intervention in commercial aviation. The weeks following the Hartford incident brought unexpected developments that none of the investigators had anticipated. Airport operations continued normally on the surface, but beneath the routine of daily flights and standard procedures, something fundamental had changed. Staff members began reporting experiences that defied logical explanation, yet occurred with such consistency that dismissing them became increasingly difficult. Maria Santos, a baggage handler who had worked at Hartford for 8 years, was the first to notice the pattern. During her early morning shift, 3 weeks after Flight 237's landing, she observed what appeared to be a faint, luminous trail along Runway 27. The effect lasted only moments, visible just as the sun crested the horizon and cast its first light across the tarmac. When she mentioned it to her supervisor, he initially dismissed her observation as morning light reflecting off residual moisture. But Maria wasn't the only employee experiencing unusual phenomena. Night security guard Kevin Walsh reported feeling drawn to patrol Runway 27 more frequently than other areas, though he couldn't explain the compulsion. During these patrols, he consistently experienced a profound sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the runway itself. The feeling was so distinct that he began timing his rounds to include extended observations of the area. So there you have it. The woman in white at Hartford Regional Airport remains one of aviation's most compelling mysteries. Multiple witnesses, surveillance footage, amateur recordings, and documented evidence all point to the same extraordinary conclusion. Divine intervention guided Flight 237 to safety that October evening. Whether you believe in miracles or not, the facts speak for themselves. Captain Rodriguez and his crew witnessed something that transcended human understanding, something that continues to influence airport operations to this day. What do you think really happened on Runway 27? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more unexplained mysteries that will challenge everything you thought you knew about our world.